if you look at a news media or a magazine article, they've always, they always give credit who took the picture in a reputable news source, right? There's usually, in a reputable news source, there's an author is called out, right? A contributor is called out, right? So those disclosures, those fields are already there, right? So if it was AI generated, or if you felt that, it needed, more disclosure, it doesn't feel like we're asking for something that doesn't already have an infrastructure to support it.
Hi, welcome to the Media Copilot. It's a podcast that dives into how AI is changing media, news, and communication. I'm your host, Pachal. I covered tech for a long time as a journalist, and now I have deep discussions with the media players, the builders, and the creators who are answering the question, how will we get information in the future? And how will that change the practice of news gathering and the business of media? Numbers can sometimes be a little squishy in the media business. Sometimes you have publishers that say, trust us, and then you have advertisers that say, prove it. It can get a little awkward, but that's why we have standards. And the world of standards is where my guest this week lives. It's Rich Murphy, and he's the CEO, president, and managing director of AAM. AAM is the Alliance for Audited Media, and it's been a trusted third party that checks numbers and claims. And it's now aiming that same idea to AI with an ethical AI certification. So what does that mean? What's an ethical AI certification? Well, we're going to talk about what that means. How do you set a standard around ethical AI use? What it actually takes for a media company to earn that kind of stamp of approval? Especially when the tech is changing so fast. So I'm curious about all of this stuff, but it's sounding like progress, and I need to ask Rich about it. So Rich Murphy, welcome to the Media Copilot.
Pete, thanks so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be here with you today.
Cool. I am just so excited to get into this with you because, like I said just now, it sounds like progress. We're all kind of like, at the beginning of this technology and have been for a few years. It's kind of been the wild, wild west, as everyone likes to say. But we're like 3 years into this thing now, 3 and a bit. And it's like, there's got to be some kind of emerging, even if they're not official standards, but like practices, et cetera. And you guys are sort of always at the forefront of this. So I want to get into all of that. What does it mean?
Yeah.
What the new certification is and all the forces around it. But first, I'd like to hear a little bit more about you and your story and how you became attached to AAM. So tell me a little bit about yourself, Rich. Who are you?
Sure. Well, thanks. Thank you for that. So I've been with AAM for about 4 years now, but I came into AAM through a merger of BPA Worldwide and AAM coming together. And when we both pretty much did the same thing, we both media assurance organizations. BPA had a very global footprint, was focused on B2B and tech, and AAM had a more North American footprint with large news media and mainstream consumer magazine measurement. And so we merged in 2023, and I became the leader in 2024 of AAM. And by coming together, Pete, we are now the largest independent, not-for-profit media assurance company in the world. And what does that mean? We're actually a membership organization that's made up of publishers and brands and agencies, all working together to advance the industry by elevating trust, transparency, and accountability in media. So it's an industry formed by the industry, governed by the industry, to make sure that, like you said earlier, that publishers' figures can be trusted by advertisers, and publishers can trust that other publishers that they're competing with are competing fairly. So we kind of act as that role in the middle. And so, we've been around 100 years, and just like media, we've evolved, with media along the way. And the latest evolution is the introduction of AI, and what that has such a profound impact on publishing. We could talk all day about that, right? From
I don't think my listeners have all day, but yes, we could. We'll zero in on a few things.
Yeah, but but we recognized there was a need for some framework around the use of AI in the media context. So we started working on that. So happy to share the how we got started and the evolution of that and how we got here.
Yeah, I think everyone is sort of recognized with this technology and its potential to create content, create the material that even content is based on and all the things around it. Like something would need to happen in terms of at least standards and practices. But before we get into the actual certification and sort of
Mhm.
how to do it, I'd love to sort of understand like do you see trust failures out there, like what, like in other words, like set the stage of this precise problem.
Sure.
Not just, I think the the advertising side of it is kind of like, oh, we get it, like there can be, like I said at the beginning, numbers and stuff,
Yep.
but with
Sure. Sure.
AI,
Sure.
it's so new and we're kind of like what, not as new anymore. Like what are the sort of almost situational examples you've seen in the last few years that like, oh, okay, so here's where there's a gap of trust but the problem is solvable.
Exactly. Exactly. So like most initiatives that we have, because we're a membership organization, our members bring in their challenges to us and ask if we can help, develop a solution. And that's what happened, with the ethical AI program. So it was actually the news media industry approached us first and said that they were being challenged by their subscribers and their readers, about the use of AI in creating content and the disclosures around there. And then, there's a lot of challenge with, trust in news right now. And, AI just happens to be one of them. Right. But it was a
Right.
challenge that they
One of the
felt
factors.
that we could help fix. Right. And so, we took that request upon us and we started to take a look, Pete, what's available, like, and where do you start and what's available? So we started looking around at, are there other frameworks? Are there other documents? Are there other, guidance that we could lean on? And we started looking around and, there's documents from the government like NIST, there's documents from Pointer, and, they were really broad, Pete. And what we recognize, and they were kind of built for organizations that were building LLM models, not using them, right?
Right.
And so as you got into them, they became really very comprehensive and really dense. And we're like, this is over engineered for what we need now. We need a crawl, walk, run solution for our publishers. And so, we read all these documents, we went through them, and we tried to identify, okay, well, what are the key elements, and we settled on, like 8 pillars. Actually, there were 7 pillars. And then we brought it to our committees and they came up with another one. I'll tell you a little more about that later, and then they're like 8 pillars. Right. And I'm like, oh, that's a nice balanced number. We can work with that. And so that's how it started. Like most things start with us, publishers or media buyers ask us to help with a problem, and we go and we do some research, and we come back with an idea. And then like any organization, like a not-for-profit, like we have committees and working groups, and we just keep polishing it till we get to the point, where we think it's ready. That's the
Yeah.
start of it.
I'm curious. You mentioned Pointer. They do good work, and I know they have. This might have been after your research, but I'm curious. I know they provide a certain amount of like resources, like if you're a newsroom or an organization, they'll like, okay, here's sort of a template you can follow, and here's some guidance on it. I'm curious. One, did that exist during your research? And two, I'm also wondering, did some of the individual, maybe early policies that newsrooms had created, could you see sort of emerging standards by common threads between those sort of things? Some people were a little bit out ahead on it. Like I remember drafting some guidelines when I was at CoinDesk, and sort of looking at if there weren't that many out there at the time. It was like 2023, but I know Wired was out ahead, like the tech forward publications. So I'm curious how much like the industry's sort of bobbing and weaving around this tech up until you guys researched it played a role.
Yeah, like anything else, there were some early adopters that had introduced some policies into their organizations. Others, and some had called it out separately. Others kind of wove it into their terms and conditions or general ethics policies, and others had done nothing. Right, so it
Yeah,
really,
too many.
spanned the spectrum, of who you were dealing with. So, and we talked a little bit about Pointer. What we got mostly from them is guidance on disclosures. Like, when do you call this out and where? And I'll talk more about that. And that kind of drove us in the beginning. I'm not going to name any names, but there was in the consumer space, what really accelerated the discussion was there were some articles published, with authors,
Right. AI
and
authors.
yeah,
Right.
and
Yeah.
without being disclosed as AI
Yeah.
authors, right?
Right.
And when that came out, that became a really, a challenging, a flashpoint, right? And that's when it first came up on my radar. And then all of a sudden, but also, Pete, like, if not daily, every other day or every week, you're seeing something where somebody was really not very transparent with their use of AI. They're referencing experts that don't exist, authors that don't exist, events that don't exist, and so that kind of just started the discussion about how do we get there? How do we get there from here? So that was the driver, and those were some of the sources that we used,
Cool.
to help move this forward.
So let's get into the nitty gritty of it. Like, start
Sure.
walking me through it. So you mentioned the 8 pillars. We don't have to start there, but like
Yeah.
maybe we just start with um, what is the certification? The high level goal of it, as applied to people who have it, like in just in plain language. But also, I guess a good place to start is also who is it meant to reassure, right? Because you mentioned the audiences, but I think we have all the parties, right? You have like the publisher, the audiences, also their partners, advertisers, or what have you. Even people who might want to do business with them, and thinking about I wanted to get in this later, but keep it in mind as we think about, like, I feel like in a lot of the incidents that you're talking about with regard to what you might consider a breach of trust, it's often a third party, like it's a contributor, so like
100%.
I
Yes.
feel like that is a very important line of communication that is often overlooked. So anyway, start with the high
Yeah.
level and let's go to the
Yeah.
pillars.
That's a great point. That's a great observation, and we will hit on that. So anyway, let's talk from the beginning. So we started researching all these documents. They were voluminous and they were dense, and we're like, well, let's get down to something that's really practical that we can implement now. And you brought it up, like, there's a tremendous amount of scope creep when it comes to AI because it really impacts everything, right? We started about the creation of content and the disclosure of content, but as we started to get further and further into it, we realized that AI is touching every element, from the creation of the story to the publishing to the distribution. And so our original goal to address the content piece really expanded to a more holistic view, of the organization, right? And so we created these pillars kind of as a framework, right? And we identified, these are the important pieces. And so I'm just going to go through them quickly. So you have, do you have the right policies in place, right? That's the first thing. We talked about that first. Like, do people even know what the organization's standards and policies are, right? And if you are going to use, that's the first one. On the second one, do you have your policies cover transparency and disclosures, right? Do you just have an overarching policy at the footer to say, hey, we use AI, or are you disclosing at the content level, right? And I think where all the challenges happens actually is at the content level, not at the corporate level, right? Um, I'll go to the next one. I'm going to come back to the last one. The next one that was really important for us was accountability and human oversight, right? That was just so important that you just cannot leave it to AI to run with these stories or to run with any kind of process without any kind of oversight. And so that had to be built into the process as well. If you were building your own LLM model, or if you were training an LLM model, you had to account for bias and fairness, right? At the macro level, that you have to be aware of that. If you're building into it, you have to address it in one way, shape, or form. Next is are you, what are you doing about the data? How are you protecting,
Hmm.
the end user's data with the PII, the personal information, right? A lot of this information comes through, and, there are very broad definitions of what's PII, right? And globally they get even broader. So what are you doing, if you have access to personal information, and how are you safeguarding it? Then the next point was training and education. All right, what are you doing to make sure that the policies of the organization are actually being communicated to the line people,
Right.
and being followed, right? So that's one
Internally,
thing. That
right? You're
are they
talking about,
aware,
yeah. Hmm.
right? Are they aware what the policies are? And then there's a level of continuing education, because we talked about this. Like it changes so quickly. The advancements are unbelievable. Claude. Every day you read a new advancement with Claude, right? And then lastly, a level of risk and mitigation. There is risk in using in AI, because you're moving away from people. And so what are your policies and processes, to mitigate risk, right? So those were seven. So we had
Yeah.
seven. I told you
I
I
was
was
just
going to
going to
get
ask.
these.
I thought I was counting.
Yeah, so there were seven, right? And so we actually brought that to our news media group, and they came back to us and they said, they're like, what's missing? They're like, rights and permissions, right? Do you have the rights and permissions to use this information? Right? And we're like, how did we miss that? Right? And so, we quickly went back, did a little more research on rights and permissions. What kind of rights do you get through, a Gemini or a chat or Anthropic, right? And what do you get on your own? And so we actually added rights and permissions into the program. And so we created this program. And remember, it was first for publishers. Those were the publishers are the ones that came to us, and so we built it for them. But to your point earlier, you commented that, like, there are many use cases for this. And that's what we started to recognize, right? So, no sooner did we push this out, that the first company to reach out to us was actually an ad tech intermediary called Integral Ad Science, right? And Integrated Science is, one of the large content verification, fraud verification companies in the digital media ad tech space, right? And they were introducing AI into all of their products, and they reached out to us and said, with a little bit of tweaking, this could apply to us too. So we actually work with their team. They have a very robust compliance team, and we work with them to say, let's move this away from just publishing, into more media, focus and organization focus. So we did that, and no sooner did we do that, we started hearing about challenges on the buy side and on the creative side,
Hmm.
right? And that,
Okay.
wait a second, are creatives being, created, using AI? Are they being represented as human, right? Cannes Lion had to come up with a whole new category, augmented by AI, or I think it's augmented by AI. It's one of those, a
Yeah.
very, diplomatic term,
We
right?
could, we should talk about terminology. I've got a couple some questions, but
Yeah,
go on.
yeah. So I think it's augmented or accelerated by AI. But there's a new Cannes Lion category that addresses that, because there was a bit of a kerfuffle, a
Yeah,
couple
for
years
sure.
ago, where they
And
handed
what?
out awards, that
Yeah.
for AI work. So anyway, so it,
Yeah.
it brings us back to, there's really a 360-degree view here, from the consumers to the publishers to the media buyers, right? And then you're also hearing it, from their partners and their sponsors. So you were right when you said it does have many applications, and we're finding that as well.
Yeah. So why don't we start with the disclosure bit? Because it is talking about, like, you mentioned the sort of labels, and I feel like there is a sort of a wide variety of not just terminology, but the degree to which you disclose. Sometimes it's like a lack of disclosure obviously would be bad, but then sometimes it's a label that is very vague, like, AI, this is AI assisted. Well, what does that mean? Like,
Yeah,
did
agreed,
did it
agreed.
did the AI write it? Did it just sort of draft something and someone else do it, or was it just like research or whatever? So are there components to the disclosure one, or is it just as long as you have it, you're at least ahead of the game or something? Like how do you think about that?
Sure, sure. So this is actually interesting. So, um, you know how you launch product. You launch and then you iterate, right? And so, when we came out of the box, you know, we just like right it needs or requires disclosure. Like we really didn't have a lot of insight because we hadn't really seen much yet, right? So we were just kind of putting very broad, guardrails around disclosures. One at the organizational level, and then we just had some vague guideline around, at the content level. And it kind of sat there for a little while. And then not too long ago, maybe 2 months ago, maybe the IAB came out with their AI disclosure transparency framework,
Okay.
and it's actually written for creatives, right? So the
Mhm.
IAB transparency framework and disclosure framework is written from the creator's point of view, right? But when I read it, or when we read it, we're like, okay, we didn't really approach our program from that way, but the the way that they identified when disclosure is required and where disclosure should take place, we thought that that was very applicable to our program. And so we reached out to the IAB and we told them, listen, this is a great document. We're going to use, some of the disclosure work that you've done and augment our document as well. And the IAB's approach, which I think is great, is it doesn't focus on the technology used necessarily. It focuses on was the end user, misled in any way, right? And so regardless of what kind of technology you use, was it represented one way, but it's something else, right? How does how did it impact the end user? And I thought that was a good approach to the use of AI in content. And so that's what really drove. So then we went back and augmented our disclosure, category. So basically, just to kind of highlight it at the high level, like, without disclosure, would it mislead the end consumer in any way, right? Would disclosure add, required necessary, insight? If it was if it was an image created just from text to a prompt, that should be disclosed. That didn't exist before, right? If you're putting, words into a person's mouth, or you're making a digital twin of someone and they're saying something that they didn't say or they would never say, that requires disclosure as well, right? So
Oh
I
yeah,
think
this would cover kind of like recreation type videos, I suppose, if you're in news
exactly.
media. Yeah, yeah,
Right,
interesting.
right. So we had guidelines for, if it was 100% written by text and prompt, that should be disclosed. If it's misleading in any way, AI versus human, that should be disclosed. And if it was anything generated, from a prompt generated, that should be disclosed. Right. And those became, and again, they came from the IAB, and they actually became pretty good, principles to follow. And then they did a good job of saying, okay, what and where does it need to be disclosed, at the content level? Does it need to, is it a one-time disclosure? Does it have to carry with the piece? Should there be, a level of watermarking that goes onto the content, so as it
Oh
moves, you
wow.
can you can you
Yeah.
can trace provenance, as it moves along the chain, right? So those are recommendations because it's early days, but we think that that's probably where it should go, that there would be some sort of watermark that you can, follow the
Yeah,
provenance
it'd
as
be
it
it'd
as it
be a
moves
tough
along.
standard today, but
Agreed.
if there's more progress, that's a whole separate conversation on, are we seeing good progress in that area? But
Hmm.
assuming we
Right.
do, that could sort of work its way into it.
Yeah.
I'm
Right.
glad you're thinking about it.
Yeah. And then just to spend a little more time on the disclosure at the content level. So, we had a lot of discussion internally about is that overwhelming? If you had to call it out every time. And I think on the surface, it feels like it could be a lot, but But once you get past the emotional piece of it and you actually look what's really happening, on the coal face, that, if you look at a news media or a magazine article, like there's always a picture byline. Right? They've always, they always give credit who took the picture in a reputable news source. Right? There's usually, in a reputable news source, there's an author is called out, right? A contributor is called out, right? So those disclosures, those fields are already there, right? So if it was AI generated, or if you felt that, it needed, more disclosure, it's not like it doesn't feel like we're asking for something that doesn't already have an infrastructure to support it, right? And I also think that, the reputable news organizations, which are really the core members of AAM, you know they 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 probably use AI to augment their work and actually maybe create, new stats or stuff that really gets automated. But I think that they already do a good job of disclosure and giving credit. So I'm not as concerned as some of the others, but it'll be something that we'll have to talk about, further with our members to see if they're
So
concerned.
is there a stage, like I feel like AI as it's permeating all of our work, um like the certification is again, it's not entirely I think, but mostly to deal with AI and content. Like I feel like way I sort of often frame this with um the content creation process, you have like the sort of inception, the actual sort of thinking about the article, like the writing, the creation of the content. And then there's sort of publishing, distribution, right? So sort of three stages of the pipeline. And I always sort of talk about, oh yeah, AI is more to offer on the two ends than the middle. And we're kind of talking about the middle here because I do feel like in the research ideation phase, like using AI is kind of it's almost like a word processor almost at this point, like if someone's going to use Perplexity to research just picking some random LLM, but like, to research their thing and then use that info, et cetera. Like, I don't frankly think that warrants a disclosure, but the gray area between this thing came out of the LLM and then I'm using that for the article, that needs to be dealt with. And I imagine it's mostly through in your framework, the policy part of it, right? Which is to
Correct.
say, if your policy doesn't have some kind of clearly drawn lines there, that's a problem.
Agreed. Agreed. Yeah, and we did, and again, this is where the IAB document was pretty good as well. They did call out that, pre-production and post-production use of AI, does not require disclosure. We thought that was,
Well, I've got a
very
quirky question about that, but go on.
yeah, yeah. We thought that was pretty practical advice, or counsel, and so we actually, built that into our program as well. Right. So
Yeah, the
yes,
post
you're right.
production,
It's kind of
I kind of depends what we're talking about. You know what I mean? Because I
mhm.
also feel like post production, to me, in my mind, as a sort of journalist publisher, is like, oh, that includes social media, which is also kind of content, right? So this is where things get really gray, and I don't know the right answer here because again, when I advise newsrooms and journalists on this, and I again, I try not to give answers and make more judgments, but it is like think about the network, think about the standards there. So you think about like, and I always pull out LinkedIn because LinkedIn is infamous for having tons of AI generated posts, or at least
Mhm.
even I shouldn't characterize it that way. Probably AI assisted posts. Like in other words, someone will get AI to
Yes.
help them write it, and then I have no doubt they go in and sort of tweak it. And I'll confess, even here on this podcast, I do that myself sometimes. But I do not disclose like that. Generally, again, sometimes if I'm making a point, I will. But it's like that just seems like the norm of the network at
Agreed.
that point. You know what I mean? So,
Yes.
so it's like you have to sort of take all of this into account as you think about what's the right practice here. Because as a practical matter, I don't think it's that necessary to put AI assisted with this on every LinkedIn post.
We agree with you. We agree with you.
Nice.
Right. And we're actually
Woo! Oh,
taking
I was breaking out a sweat there, Rich.
no, no, no. No, again, this is, I think it's going to iterate, right? It'll get better. So we didn't want to make it too arduous to comply with, right? And so, we have it as, if it's 100%, written, pre-production, production, post-production, by AI, no human oversight, that requires disclosure. But if they're, if humans have gone in and they've edited and changed it or modified it in any way, we don't think that needs a
Yes.
disclosure.
Cool. So walk me
Right.
through the process of, if you're a publisher, you're interested in this certification. How does it go to, from the first call to the final outcome?
Yeah. So it's interesting. We're looking at now, you know, at first, we sell, this is an add-on service, of course, that we sell, right? But we're also exploring, like, it's so important, we feel, that it might be something that we bake into the entire membership, that, as part of being, a member of AAM, right? If you're a publisher member of AAM, you get an audit, every year, and you produce numbers every 6 months. Like, this is starting to feel like so foundational to us that, we start to bake it into the AAM membership. So we're talking about that internally. But as far as, as far as the process goes, we have our 8 pillars and we have our marketing materials, right? But behind that, Pete, is a more detailed checklist of, here are the elements for the policies. Here's what they should say at the minimum. Here's where they should be accessible, to the public and not behind a paywall, right? Here's, here are the what are your disclosures? What's your transparency? So there's I don't want to say it's a long checklist, but it's comprehensive, right? Where he takes all of these 8 pillars and it kind of blows them out into line items, right? For people to go through, and then they work with their teams and, okay, we have this, here's a link to that, here's our internal policy. That's not public AAM. That's just for you. Keep that, for your review only. Right. And so they work with their teams and then they put that package together. Then they send it over to the AAM team, and we have a full audit team. We have an engineering and a project management team, and then we also have a large media audit team that it gets farmed out into those groups as well, right? So it comes in, it gets reviewed, and it lands in the person who knows the account the best, right? Because auditors and managers have different accounts with us. So it really starts with the checklist, completing the information, submitting it to us. Now, the challenge that we have, which we find with a lot of, as media evolves and expands, they start crossing teams, Pete. So the people that you're used to dealing with for your audience figures, and data, are not necessarily the team that's talking about what your editorial policy is and what your
Right.
disclosure policies. And so we're navigating that now, right? We're
Yeah.
navigating, how do we cross, our normal audience and compliance team that we're working with, now we're getting introduced to more, either general management or editorial teams as we get into some of these areas.
Yeah.
So we're working through
Yeah.
that.
It's funny. I'll bet in some of the places you'll find that there's a probably a lack of internal communication between some of those teams. And that's sort of as I mean,
Yeah.
by cultural design, the editorial teams like to sort of, to remain independent for obvious reasons. They're journalists and
Hmm.
they don't want to be influenced by business. But then it's like once there's a thing where they kind of need to talk and get together, it's like, oh, you're doing this, you're doing that, and there's might be the first time you're bringing people together and getting them to actually
Yeah.
chat.
Yeah, we think so. Yeah, but we've
Yeah,
come across this before, when our publishers, started to pivot towards digital, right? So, at first, there was a print team and then a digital team, but as it became, more integrated, then you could talk to the same people. But, we've been through this before,
yeah,
so we're going to lean on that experience as we try to navigate through this.
yeah. You're dating yourself there, by the way, Rich. We're talking about
Fair
print.
enough.
Don't worry,
Fair
I
enove.
I remember it too. I started in
Yeah, yeah,
magazines,
it's
and
still a
then
thing. It's still important.
yep,
It's still very
yep.
important for our
So,
members.
just the last question about this are if say someone has like major gaps and they need to fill in before they can get the certification, is there a pause? Is there like a remediation? Like how does that work?
Yeah, usually there's, well, not usually, always there's a remediation process, right? And that goes for all of our certification work that we do, and we'll go through it, and we have like 4 categories really, right? So, satisfactory, it meets expectations. You have a recommendation, which means that okay, it meets the requirement, but there's a better way to do it. We're going to tell you how to do it. There would be a requirement, which means like this is a material issue. We can't go any further until this is addressed, right? And so bring it back to your team. What do you need? Do you need a week? Do you need a month? Do you need 6 months? Right, depending on what the scope of it is, right? And then last, if it's an element that's not applicable, then it's off the thing. But generally, you're dealing with satisfactory, recommendation, or requirement, right? The first two will get you over the finish line. The last one, if it's a material issue, we work with you to address it. And if you can't address it, it just kind of sits there. You won't get your seal, right? And or if you have a seal, it might get revoked or placed on probation. Uh, we haven't got to that point yet, but those are some avenues that we could pursue.
So, there's obviously been movement on the legal side of things and some interesting regions, at least, and industries. You mentioned IAB. There's like the New York Fair News Act, I think. There's basically like a bunch of interest in this, especially with respect to media and content. How
Mm-hmm.
should publishers um, think about this vis-a-vis sort of laws being kicked around,
Sure.
and how do you think about industry, I guess, how do you think about industry standards versus legal requirements?
Yeah, I think if you asked, you know, uh, publishers, intermediaries, platforms, buyers, I think they would prefer to self-regulation over government regulation, right? And if you think about a lot of the IAB and even AAM, AAM was originated back in the early days when it was all print, right? And so that it's regulation. Then you have the IAB; they have a lot of guidelines and standards. Are self-regulated. We actually do. AAM does a lot of the certification work for IAB, IAB Tech Lab, Trustworthy Accountability Group, and so I think the industry prefers self-regulation over government regulation. And so the way that we're positioning this is, you know it it's coming. So if we get our act together now, right, and do a good job at self-regulation, then maybe we can hold off government regulation on this front, right? So that's how we're pursuing it, because I think that it's better handled within the industry with experts who live and breathe the industry, rather than with lawmakers that just kind of pop into the space, um, and just are not as intimate, with the in and outs of the industry. So I think that, self-regulation is preferable to government regulation. And that's why we're creating these programs.
And what is the business case, you would say, the elevator pitch you would give to a skeptical publisher? I think you just made part of it with the whole self-regulation as opposed to government regulation, but just broadly, like, why, what would you say to them? Like, this is how this will help your business.
Well, I think there's a few things actually. So, we talked about it earlier. We talked about the erosion of trust, right? That, and you also have like there's a, there's an age gap with the acceptance of AI generated materials, right? But there's an overall, skepticism to it, right? And so by going through this process, we have a seal. I could send it to you as AAM certified ethical AI,
Nice.
right? And you
Put it on
can
my
put
wall.
that on.
Put it
There you
right there.
go. It can go on your website. It can go in on your masthead, right? It can go in your media kits. It can go in your subscription offers, right?
Mhm.
And so the end user, whether they're a consumer, whether they're a partner, whether they're a regulator, they can see these guys have gone through this process of self review and independent certification, and that adds a level of comfort for all parties, we feel.
That makes a lot of sense. So Um, AI is obviously changing super fast. Like models get new versions, vendors will swap their systems. A workflow that was just experimental like a month ago becomes something that is just kind of widely adopted. It's kind of nuts. I mean, how fast this is going. Are you confident that what you've put together is something that's going to be fairly agnostic even as the tech improves? Or certainly I'm sure you'll update it, but like how do you even think about this sort of rapidly changing area where entire work, not just workflows, but areas of work are now being thought about as potentially automated, or at least AI, the bulk of it being done by AI. Again, I know not. I don't presume this is going to solve
Yeah,
society's
no, no, no.
challenges with AI, but like, it must be something you think about.
Yeah. Uh, Actually, I think the 8 pillars have a fair amount of longevity to them. What happens within them and the technology and the tools that they use, for, transparency, disclosures, verifying rights, privacy, those can all change. But I feel we feel very confident that the 8 pillars address the key elements of responsible and ethical AI use across the organization. And again, these were built for a broader base guidelines that we've kind of tailored into the media industry. But you could take these, to any industry, and they make sense, right? Just the tools and the processes may be different, but everything in the program, you know, from any organization you could look at it and go, yeah, that applies to me. And so I think, of course, we have to be open to change, but I think the change will be within each pillar, not necessarily in the pillars. But we would be open to that, as things change, of course.
So last question, it's often the same. Like, I want to know one thing that you are hopeful about with respect to AI in our media ecosystem, and one thing you are concerned about that might be keeping you up at night.
Sure,
In
sure.
whatever
So
order you like.
yeah. Well, well, I'll be the concerning point. Uh, did you read that memo that tanked the stock market yesterday by 800 points from the uh,
For,
Citronelli Group?
well, to lock us in time and space, we're recording this on February 24th so that people
Yeah.
can
So this
zero
is
in on
this.
it. But why don't you give a
Yeah.
little background to what happened?
Yeah. I think it was 2 days ago. The stock market, I think they lost, 800 points. And they were saying the reason it lost 800 points is because a memo came out from two researchers uh, predicting what the world will look like in 2030, 2028, 2030. And it talked about how AI will just eat itself, right? And
Hmm.
that it's a vicious circle, like, most times, booms and recessions are self-correcting, right? You build too many houses, you raise rates, you lower the house supply, and it gets corrected. But in their piece, they talked about AI is there's no self-correction piece in the loop, and that the answer to address some of the challenges of AI is actually more AI, and it actually accelerates the circle. And so that's why I think IBM lost 10% yesterday, and 800 points off the market. So if you read that report, you're like, oh my God, this could happen, right? But you know, but just as equally cannot happen, right? There are new opportunities that come from AI, and new jobs and new opportunities, right? So that's there's two sides to that, right? But on the positive side, it really is an amazing tool that is pretty much improving almost everything that we do, certainly here, and at a lot of publishers as well. So you know you know um you know higher quality, augmenting with AI is leading to more efficiency. It's leading to better quality work, right? New insights, new opportunities. And so I think that that's really exciting to be in this space, and seeing all that it could do, right?
Nice.
But there really are two sides to it, that you have to be you have to be, aware of both sides. But I'm more
Got it.
optimistic than pessimistic for sure.
So optimistic about the acceleration that it's actually letting people do more work, but also like, hey, on a aggregate or sort of grand scale, that could have a result where you get the eating yourself scenario, and
Yeah.
we're all eaten.
Let's hope not.
I'm not leaving it on that note. This has been great though. It's been awesome sort of diving into the AAM certification and sort of the more fundamental point of like, what does a good AI policy and managing of that policy look like? Rich Murphy, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Pete. Appreciate the time.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Rich Murphy. The Media Copilot is a podcast, and it would be fantastic if you could give the show a star rating. If you're on Spotify, scroll in, hit the star. A like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. Probably find those around the window here. And a review if you're on Apple. All of those things really do help the show because they put our podcast in front of more people. The Media Copilot podcast is produced by Michelle Musso and Ryan Huntington of Musso Media. Look for their link in the show notes, and don't forget to subscribe to the Media Copilot newsletter as well. Thanks again for being here, and be seeing you in the future.